Certifications are one of the most confusing and stressful parts of developing and launching a new electronic product. It feels overwhelming because you don't know what certification your product even needs, you don't know when in the process you're going to need them, and you don't know how much they're going to cost. So let's walk through the different things that make up these costs, and then once you understand all the pieces, the total number at the end will make a lot more sense. Hi, I'm John Teal. I'm a former microchip design engineer who brought my own product to market, and now I help others develop and launch their electronic products inside my hardware academy. One of the biggest costs is lab testing. For FCC certifications, the most important distinction is whether you're using a pre-certified radio module or designing your own custom radio. If you're designing a custom radio, then your product is considered an intentional radiator. Those have to be tested in an FCC recognized lab, and those labs are more expensive. But if your product doesn't have a radio at all, or if you use a wireless module that's already pre-certified, then you qualify for what's called the SDoC process, or Supplier's Declaration of Conformity. In that case, you can use an accredited lab, which tends to be cheaper than an FCC recognized lab. Where you do the testing also makes a big difference. Labs in the US and Europe are typically going to be more expensive, while testing in China is often much cheaper, sometimes at just a fraction of the cost. The trade-offs with doing your testing in China are things like communication, time zones, and sometimes turnaround time. And in general, doing anything in China is almost always cheaper, but also usually a lot slower. But if cost is your biggest concern, China can be a much more affordable option compared to the US or Europe. And by the way, if you want to know exactly which certifications your specific product needs and what they're going to cost, I built a certification tool that does exactly this for you. You answer just a few questions about your product, and it tells you the certifications and the costs that you can expect. You'll find the link in the description, or you can scan this QR code. Another way to control cost is through pre-compliance testing, which is basically early testing before your design is finalized. The benefit here is that it lets you catch problems early before you're locked into too many design decisions. For example, you might run pre-compliance tests on a bare board without the finished enclosure just to see if there are any EMI issues that need to be solved early. If you're using a simple microcontroller or a pre-certified wireless module, pre-compliance may not be worth the money. But if you're building a complex custom design with your own radio or high-speed digital circuits, then early testing can save you from a disaster later. You don't want to wait until the very end, get the entire product developed and tested, and then find out that it fails and you're stuck with months of redesign. Even with pre-compliance, there's always risk of failures and retesting, and this is where certification costs really tend to spiral out of control. If your product fails, you're not just paying another lab fee. You'll have to spend a new board, rebuild your prototypes, and ship them back for testing. And EMI problems in particular are not straightforward to debug. The lab won't tell you what on your PCB caused the issue, they'll just tell you that you failed. And unlike debugging a functional problem, you can't just easily hook up an oscilloscope and spot the culprit. So you might end up rerouting ground planes, adding filters, or changing the enclosure, and you won't know for sure if it's fixed until you pay for another test. This is why designing for compliance from the very beginning is so important. Once you're stuck in the fail and retest cycle, the cost and delays pile up fast. Certifications also come with a mountain of paperwork. Test reports, technical files, declarations of conformity, and yes, the labs charge you for this too. It feels a little crazy to pay hundreds of dollars just for someone to shuffle papers, but that's part of the process, and it's not been replaced by AI just yet. Or maybe it has, but they're still charging you the same for it. The exact type of certifications your product needs is, of course, one of the biggest cost drivers. One of the main types is testing for electromagnetic interference, and in the US, that's done through the FCC, and in Europe, it's through CE. This testing makes sure your product isn't interfering with other devices and that it can handle interference itself. It's often the most expensive category, especially if you're designing a custom radio. If you use a pre-certified module, you avoid a lot of that cost and risk. Another big category is safety testing. If your product plugs into AC mains, then you should expect significant safety certification costs. UL is one of the most common standards in the US, though there are also IEC and other options that may apply depending on the market. For products powered by batteries, especially lithium ion, there are also safety certifications needed. The simplest path is just to use a pre-certified battery pack. If you do that, you're mostly covered. But if you create your own custom battery pack, then you're looking at much more testing and much higher certification costs. Environmental certifications also add to the bill. These include things like ROHS and WEEE. Just say that WEEE. ROHS is restricting hazardous substances like lead in the electronics, and WEEE is for electronic waste. In the US, it's more of a patchwork. California is the only state that requires ROHS certification. And then as far as the recycling, the WEEE certification in the US, it's done more on a state-by-state basis. Environmental certifications are generally more about documentation than lab time, so they're not nearly as expensive as EMI or safety, but they still add cost and complexity and need to be considered and planned appropriately. And keep in mind that medical devices or industrial equipment often require a whole other set of certifications beyond what we've talked about here, which can add even more cost and complexity. Certifications aren't global. Passing FCC doesn't mean you're automatically cleared for Europe, and passing CE doesn't cover Canada or Japan. Each region has its own requirements. The smart move is to start with a single region, usually either the US or Europe. Once you've passed in one of those markets, you can start selling and generating revenue. Then use that momentum to expand into other regions later. The good news is that if your product can pass FCC or CE testing, it will probably pass in most other regions too, often with little or no design changes required. Now, before I share the actual price ranges that certifications are going to cost, I want to quickly mention again the certification tool that I built. This tool is going to just ask you a series of questions about your product, where you plan to sell it, and what components you're using, and then it tells you exactly which certifications you'll need and what they're going to cost. You'll find the link in the description below, or you can access it by scanning this QR code. Okay, now let's talk about some real numbers. So if your product doesn't have a custom radio, or if it uses a pre-certified wireless module and a pre-certified battery pack, then certification costs usually fall in the range of about $3,000 to $8,000. That's where most simpler products are going to end up falling. But if your product does have a custom radio or a custom battery pack or multiple advanced features, then costs can climb much higher. For those kinds of products, it's not unusual to see certification costs go well over $50,000. That's why product simplicity is so critical if you're working with a limited budget. But don't let these numbers scare you away. You can delay most certification costs until really late, as long as you've been designing with compliance in mind from the start. And you don't necessarily have to pay for certifications out of your own pocket. In fact, most people, I recommend that you don't. One of the best ways to fund certifications is to pre-sell your product first. You can run a Kickstarter campaign or take pre-orders directly on your website and then use that money to pay for certifications and your first round of manufacturing. That's exactly how many successful hardware startups do it, and it's the approach that I recommend for most people. If you'd like more help figuring out certifications for your product and making sure that you design with compliance in mind, we can help you out inside my Hardware Academy. If you found this video on certifications helpful, then check out this video here next.